Albert Speer was the man who gave Hitler's dreams concrete form, the architect who transformed ideology into stone and steel. Before we continue, this video isn't free. The price is a like, a comment, and a subscription. His rise from a quiet, apolitical designer to one of the most powerful figures in the Third Reich remains one of the most unsettling transformations of the 20th century. He didn't begin as a fanatic, a revolutionary, or even a skilled manipulator. He began as something far more ordinary, a gifted architect from a wealthy family who believed he was entering a world of culture, precision, and order. Instead, he walked into the heart of a disaster. Albert Speer was born on March 19, 1905, in Mannheim, a prosperous city in southwest Germany. His upbringing was comfortable, traditional, and steeped in expectations. The Speer family were architects for generations, respectable professionals who lived clean, structured lives. Albert grew up surrounded by blueprints, measuring tools, and discussions of facades and foundations. His father, Albert Friedrich Speer, was strict and distant, a man who believed success was measured in productivity and discipline. His mother, Louise, cultivated refinement, music, literature, polite society. They intended their son to become the next link in the family chain, refined, responsible, respectable. And for many years, Speer followed the script perfectly. He studied architecture at prestigious institutions, first Karlsruhe, then Munich, then Berlin, learning classical design under Heinrich Tessenow, a man who preached simplicity and restraint. Speer admired him deeply and tried to model himself after his quiet, rational demeanor. By his mid-20s, Speer had a reputation as a talented but conventional architect, someone who valued proportion and function over political theater. If history had taken a different turn, his name might have ended up attached to museums, civic halls, or private estates. But Germany was unraveling. The Weimar Republic was weak and bleeding from all sides. Street battles between communists and Nazis, mass unemployment, a middle class sinking into despair. And in 1931, a colleague cast Speer later invited Speer to attend a rally where Adolf Hitler would speak. Speer agreed, not out of political passion, but because he had nothing better to do that afternoon. He went as an observer, a spectator. He left as a convert. Speer later described the experience as overwhelming, almost hypnotic. Hitler's voice, the fiery certainty, the promise of national rebirth, all of it struck the young architect like a charge of electricity. He didn't question the ideology deeply. He didn't weigh the consequences. He simply felt, for the first time, a sense of direction. Within weeks, he applied for membership in the Nazi Party. His card, number 474481, arrived quietly, almost anonymously. No one celebrated, no one objected. But this small decision would alter the trajectory of his life and the fate of millions. Speer's talent, combined with his new political affiliation, opened doors faster than he could have imagined. His first jobs were small assignments for the party, the redesign of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda offices, planning work for early rallies. He impressed his superiors with his calm efficiency. He didn't ask ideological questions. He didn't argue. He delivered results. And in the rapidly expanding machinery of the Nazi movement, reliability was gold. When Hitler seized power in 1933, Speer found himself in the right place at the right time. Major architectural commissions suddenly appeared. Stages, parade grounds, public spaces designed not for beauty, but for spectacle. Speer understood instinctively what Hitler wanted. Not just buildings, not just engineering, but symbols. Structures that made people feel small, unified, controlled. A new kind of architecture, the architecture of power. In 1934, Speer's ascent accelerated at breathtaking speed. When Hitler's favorite architect, Paul Ludwig Troost, died unexpectedly, Speer was chosen to take over some of his most important projects, including the redesign of the Reichschancellery and the massive rally grounds at Nuremberg. Here, Speer created some of the most infamous images of the Nazi era. The Zeppelin-Field Stadium with its sweeping granite stands, and the Cathedral of Light, a forest of anti-aircraft searchlights that shot pillars of white light into the night sky. It was spectacle on the scale of mythology, and Hitler loved it. The dictator, a failed artist himself, saw in Speer the man who could give form to his fantasies. Their relationship grew quickly, professional admiration turning into a strange, almost intimate alliance. Speer was young, brilliant, and efficient. Hitler loved his discipline, his ambition, and his devotion to monumental style. Soon, Speer became more than just an architect. He became a confidant, a favored mind. By 1937, Hitler appointed him General Building Inspector for Berlin, granting him sweeping powers to redesign the capital into Germania, a world capital meant to dwarf every city on Earth. Grand avenues, colossal domes, endless colonnades. The vision was imperial, apocalyptic, and deeply symbolic. Speer executed it with chilling enthusiasm. But beneath the glittering marble, something darker grew. To clear the space for these new monuments, entire neighborhoods were seized. Jewish families were evicted from their homes, pushed into overcrowded districts, and later deported to their deaths. Speer claimed afterward that he hadn't understood the scale of the tragedy, but documents and testimonies tell another story. He signed the orders, approved the removals, and watched the city reshape under his command. By 1939, Albert Speer wasn't just building Hitler's world, he was helping build his empire. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Albert Speer was already deeply embedded in the inner workings of the Nazi state, an architect whose influence reached far beyond drafting tables and construction sites. He had become a trusted figure in Hitler's immediate circle, a man whose quiet confidence and unwavering efficiency made him indispensable. Yet the role he was about to assume would transform him from the builder of a regime's monuments into the engineer of its war machine. In early 1942, fate intervened with cruel precision. Fritz Todt, the powerful Minister of Armaments and the man responsible for Germany's vast construction and military production networks, died suddenly in a mysterious plane crash, shortly after visiting Hitler's headquarters. The death sent shockwaves through the upper ranks of the Reich, but it also opened a door that only one man was positioned to walk through. Within hours, Hitler called Speer into his study and made a startling announcement. He was appointing the 36-year-old architect as Todt's successor. The decision stunned the Nazi elite. Speer was neither a military strategist nor an engineer specialized in weaponry. Yet, Hitler trusted him more than men with decades of experience. He believed that Speer's organizational talent, loyalty, and ability to cut through bureaucratic chaos would restore Germany's failing war effort. And Speer, ever confident in his own competence, accepted without hesitation. When he took over the ministry, he found a system drowning in inefficiency. Rival departments competed for the same materials. Military branches issued contradictory demands. Production lines stalled for lack of coordination. Everything from ammunition to aircraft components was buried under layers of paperwork, petty rivalries, and outdated methods. Germany was fighting a war of industrial giants with a machine built on medieval bureaucracy. Speer's response was swift and decisive. He consolidated overlapping agencies, stripped power from rival officials, and established a centralized command over nearly every sector of armaments production. He demanded accountability, enforced strict schedules, and forced cooperation between factories, military branches, and transportation networks. His reforms were drastic and often brutal, but undeniably effective. Within months, production surged. Aircraft output doubled. Tank and artillery manufacturing soared. Even as Allied bombs pummeled German industry, the numbers kept rising. Speer called it a rationalization of industry. The press hailed it as a miracle. Hitler regarded it as proof that he had chosen the right man. But behind the polished statistics lay a truth Speer rarely acknowledged. His miracle depended heavily on the massive exploitation of forced labor. Millions of foreign workers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates were absorbed into his system under horrific conditions. As the war dragged on and Germany faced severe labor shortages, Speer's ministry grew increasingly entangled with the SS, negotiating directly with Heinrich Himmler for workers pulled from occupied territories and concentration camps. Factories under Speer's oversight used men and women who lived in barbed wire enclosures, starved, beaten, and worked to exhaustion. His ministry requested more labor repeatedly and received it. While he later insisted that he had been unaware of the worst atrocities, documents proved that his signature appeared on orders coordinating the deployment of forced laborers to industries essential to the war effort. He visited sites where prisoners toiled in lethal environments. He praised the efficiency of labor systems he later pretended not to understand. Yet within Hitler's inner circle, Speer presented himself as the rational one, the modern technocrat untouched by ideological fanaticism. He wore well-tailored suits, spoke calmly, and avoided emotional outbursts. This demeanor created an illusion that he stood apart from the cruelty surrounding him. In reality, he was one of the central figures enabling the regime to continue fighting long after defeat was inevitable. By 1943, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses at Stalingrad. Allied bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers relentlessly. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. The Eastern Front was a churning disaster. And yet, astonishingly, war production continued to climb under Speer's direction. Tanks rolled off assembly lines, aircraft engines were produced in record numbers, ammunition flowed steadily to frontline divisions. Hitler praised Speer constantly, calling him one of my most valuable men. The bond between them deepened further. Hitler valued Speer's loyalty and intellect, and often sought him out in moments of crisis. Their relationship became so close that many officers considered Speer part of the dictator's inner emotional circle, one of the few people with whom Hitler could speak openly, without pretense. And Speer, flattered by the trust, worked with relentless dedication to keep the war machine functioning. But there was a cost. Speer's days became an endless cycle of meetings, inspections, and emergency decisions. He traveled constantly, factories, construction sites, command centers, trying to control a collapsing empire. His ministry expanded like a shadow government, eventually overseeing not just armaments, but transportation, construction, fuel distribution, and communications. In many respects, Speer became the de facto manager of Germany itself. Yet the more power he gained, the more he sensed the war slipping away. By late 1944, even his miracle could no longer compensate for the overwhelming might of the Allied forces. Bombs reduced entire industrial districts to rubble. Workers died faster than they could be replaced. Raw materials vanished. Despite this, Speer continued to push, insisting that victory was still possible if Germany fought with total determination. But privately, he knew the end was approaching. He began keeping notes, letters, and reflections, documents that would later become essential to the myth he crafted after the war. A myth of the good Nazi, the technocrat who served the regime but didn't believe in its cruelty, the modern man trapped in a nightmare he didn't create. In reality, Speer had built much more than monuments or production lines. He had built the machinery that allowed the war to grind on, month after month, long after all hope was gone. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet troops were advancing relentlessly from the east. Allied forces were closing in from the west, and the cities of Germany were crumbling under constant bombardment. Amid the chaos, Albert Speer remained at the center of the machine he had helped build. His ministry continued to function. Factories still produced weapons, and trains still carried materials and forced laborers to the front lines. Speer's organizational genius had delayed the inevitable, but it could not prevent it. Even as the regime around him disintegrated, Speer held an unusual position. Unlike fanatical ideologues, he did not take part in Hitler's final hallucinations of victory. He did not march blindly into the Führer's bunker with plans to die alongside him. Instead, Speer tried to navigate the end of the war with a mix of pragmatism and self-preservation. He recognized that total destruction of Germany was imminent if Hitler's scorched earth orders were carried out. According to his own post-war accounts, Speer deliberately slowed or obstructed these orders, attempting to preserve infrastructure that would later be vital to rebuilding the country. Whether these actions were moral courage or a calculated bid to save his reputation has been debated by historians ever since. By April 1945, Berlin was under siege. Hitler committed suicide on April 30, leaving Germany leaderless and fractured. Speer was acutely aware that his position made him both powerful and dangerous. The Allies were systematically rounding up Nazi leaders. Many of his colleagues, from Goering to Himmler, would soon face execution or suicide. Speer's path required careful calculation. He chose to surrender to the Americans rather than fall into Soviet hands, recognizing that the Western Allies would likely treat him more leniently and that his intellect and administrative record might make him valuable as a witness or consultant. When Allied forces arrested him in May 1945, Speer presented himself as a remorseful technocrat, a man who had served his country but remained unaware of the full extent of Nazi atrocities. He emphasized his focus on engineering, logistics, and production rather than ideology or extermination. Speer's calm demeanor and carefully crafted persona stood in stark contrast to many of his peers, who displayed panic, anger, or unrepentant arrogance. Even among hardened interrogators, Speer's conduct impressed. He was articulate, thoughtful, and cooperative, qualities that would become central to the post-war narrative of him as the good Nazi. During the Nuremberg Trials, Speer faced charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, primarily for his role in exploiting millions of forced laborers and sustaining Germany's war effort long after defeat was certain. He admitted general responsibility for the crimes of the regime, but denied specific knowledge of the final solution. This nuanced position, combined with his meticulous record-keeping and disciplined testimony, created a unique image, willing to acknowledge guilt without confessing direct complicity in atrocities. Despite overwhelming evidence that his ministry had profited from forced labor programs, the tribunal took into account Speer's cooperation and his apparent acceptance of moral responsibility. In October 1946, he was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison, avoiding the death penalty. His treatment reflected the complex duality of his role, both a key architect of the Nazi war effort and, in the eyes of some, a man who had maintained a degree of humanity and rationality amid unimaginable chaos. Life in Spandau was regimented and isolating, yet Speer adapted with the discipline of a man used to systems and order. He developed strict daily routines, reading, writing, walking, precise circuits in the prison yard, and reflecting on both personal and historical responsibility. Over the years, he compiled notebooks and diaries that would later serve as the foundation for his post-war writings. These texts portrayed a man seeking understanding, grappling with guilt, and attempting to explain his actions in a way that made sense to himself and to the world. Released in October 1966, after serving exactly 20 years, Speer re-entered a Germany transformed by defeat, reconstruction, and the Cold War. He re-established himself in public life, granting interviews, delivering lectures, and cultivating a public image of intellectual reflection and moral consideration. His memoirs, particularly Inside the Third Reich, published in 1970, presented an intimate but selective view of life within Hitler's inner circle. He emphasized his administrative genius, his technical achievements, and his supposed moral blindness to the regime's crimes, a carefully constructed narrative that resonated with post-war audiences eager to understand the Nazi era without confronting its full horror. Historians would later challenge Speer's self-portrayal, revealing archival evidence of his presence at key meetings discussing the exploitation of Jewish labor and the logistics of forced labor deployment. He had corresponded with SS officials overseeing deportations and had actively facilitated the use of millions of prisoners in armament production. Speer's later claims of ignorance or moral detachment were scrutinized and often dismissed as selective memory or self-serving deception. Nevertheless, his writings, public demeanor, and articulate reflections allowed him to retain a controversial, ambiguous legacy, the skilled technocrat, morally aware, yet deeply complicit. By the 1970s, Speer had become a symbol of both the power and the moral ambiguity of technocratic genius. His life demonstrated how intellect, ambition, and efficiency, when divorced from ethical responsibility, could sustain a criminal regime. He remained a public figure until his death in London on September 1, 1981, where he was meeting a journalist to discuss yet another book. His ashes were quietly interred in Heidelberg, closing the chapter on a life that had touched the highest peaks of power and the deepest shadows of moral compromise. Albert Speer's story serves as a cautionary tale. Brilliance and organization can be terrifying when subordinated to ideology, and even those who claim distance from evil may find themselves entangled in its machinery. He was a man who built the Third Reich's monuments, managed its war economy, and survived its collapse, not as a hero, not fully as a villain, but as a complex, morally ambiguous figure whose legacy continues to provoke debate. The final chapter of Albert Speer's life is as much about perception as it is about reality. Released from Spandau prison in 1966, he returned to a Germany that was unrecognizable from the one he had left. Cities were rebuilt from ruins. Society had grappled with the horrors of the Holocaust, and the Cold War had replaced World War II as the defining global struggle. For many, Speer represented a living connection to the Third Reich, a figure whose first-hand knowledge of Hitler's inner circle was unmatched. Speer quickly embraced public life. He gave interviews to journalists, wrote books, and spoke at lectures across Europe. His calm demeanor, articulate explanations, and polished rhetoric captivated audiences. In his memoirs, particularly Inside the Third Reich, Speer painted himself as a man caught in a whirlwind of history, a talented administrator whose ambition had propelled him into the heart of a dictatorship, yet who had maintained a certain moral distance. He admitted a general responsibility for Nazi crimes, but insisted that he had remained unaware of the full scale of atrocities, especially the Holocaust. This carefully cultivated image earned him both fame and criticism. In the post-war years, readers were fascinated by the idea of a good Nazi, someone capable of reflection and remorse amidst the machinery of mass murder. His memoirs became international bestsellers, translating into multiple languages and cementing his reputation as the most introspective member of Hitler's circle. Speer's ability to present himself as a man of conscience made him unique among the surviving leaders of the Third Reich. Yet historians began to question the veracity of his self-portrayal. Newly released documents and witness accounts contradicted his claims of ignorance. Speer had attended meetings where the logistics of forced labor were discussed. He had approved the deployment of millions of prisoners in armament production, directly benefiting from the suffering of countless individuals. At the Posen Conference in 1943, he was present when Heinrich Himmler explicitly spoke about the final solution. While he never personally signed extermination orders, the machinery he oversaw was intimately connected to it. Scholars argue that his moral blindness, selective memory, and self-deception were key elements in his survival and post-war rehabilitation. Even so, Speer remained a symbol of duality, brilliance and complicity, reflection and denial. He embodied a profound moral paradox, the technocrat who could organize a nation's resources with unmatched efficiency, yet fail to see the human cost of his own work. In interviews late in life, he spoke often of guilt, regret, and the heavy burden of responsibility. But critics pointed out that his reflections were selective, often absolving him of direct culpability while emphasizing his administrative genius. In the public eye, Speer had become more than a historical figure. He was a moral puzzle, a cautionary tale, and a living testament to the complexities of human ambition. Many readers and historians debated whether he was sincere or manipulative, whether his repentance was genuine or simply a strategic performance to secure his legacy. The fascination with Speer was not just about his proximity to Hitler, but about what his story revealed about the human capacity for compartmentalization, denial, and self-preservation in times of extraordinary evil. Albert Speer died on September 1, 1981, in London, where he was meeting a journalist to discuss yet another book. He was 76 years old. His death passed quietly, without ceremony or fanfare, yet it marked the end of an era. The man who had built Hitler's monuments, managed the Nazi war economy, and survived the collapse of the Third Reich left behind a legacy as controversial as it was instructive. His ashes were interred in Heidelberg, returning him to the city of his youth, a place untouched by the grandeur and horror he had orchestrated elsewhere. Today, Speer's story serves as both history and warning. It reminds us that intelligence, talent, and ambition can become instruments of oppression when divorced from conscience. It demonstrates how carefully constructed narratives can shape public perception, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And it challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, that ordinary people, even those of remarkable intellect, can become complicit in unimaginable crimes when seduced by power and ideology. Albert Speer remains a study in contrasts. He was the architect of monumental stone, the manager of mass destruction, the technocrat with a conscience, or the conscience he wanted others to believe he had. He was admired, condemned, celebrated, and debated. His life story, spanning from the quiet streets of Mannheim to the corridors of Hitler's power, from the chaos of Spandau prison to reflective interviews decades later, illustrates the dangerous allure of brilliance untethered from moral responsibility. In the end, Speer's legacy is not simple. It is a mirror reflecting the capacity for both creation and complicity within a single human being. It is a warning about the seductive power of authority, the dangers of self-deception, and the enduring challenge of understanding human responsibility in the face of historical catastrophe. Watching the rise and fall of Albert Speer, we are forced to ask ourselves, how far can intellect and ambition carry a person before morality becomes optional? And what remains when the monuments crumble, the war ends, and only history bears witness? Albert Speer's life ended quietly, but his story continues to echo, a cautionary tale, a historical enigma, and a reminder that genius without conscience can leave a world scarred forever.